I once sat down with a retired intelligence officer who described a morning on a carrier deck that felt like the end of the world. A foreign fighter jet had just buzzed their tower, so close the windows rattled in their frames. The younger crew members were practically sprinting to their battle stations, convinced they were about to enter a dogfight. But the officer told me he just checked his watch and went back to his coffee. To him, that pilot wasn't trying to start a war. He was delivering a message. It was a very fast, very expensive way of saying, we're unhappy with your latest move. We usually view military force as a binary, a simple light switch that's either off for peace or on for war. But for the people in those high-stakes rooms, the military isn't a switch, it's a dial. It's a sophisticated spectrum of intensity and scale where every movement is a calculated piece of statecraft. Think about it. Why does a country spend millions on a routine military exercise right on a disputed border instead of just attacking? Or why does a Navy ship cross a specific invisible line in the ocean only to turn back 10 minutes later? It's because they're operating on a ladder of escalation. Most people only notice when someone reaches the top rung, the total wars and the regime changes. But the real game, the one that actually decides the fate of global trade and borders, is played in the subtle, gray zone rungs in between. If you want to understand how the world is actually run through the barrel of a gun, you have to stop looking at war as a final destination and start seeing it as a language. To truly read the headlines, you have to understand the dimensions of that spectrum, the difference between a symbolic warning and an existential threat.
That story it's the perfect illustration, isn't it? It just perfectly captures this huge gap between how most of us see conflict and how it's actually practiced.
That's a total disconnect.
Yeah, total disconnect. We see these things happening in the news.
Yeah.
You know, a jet buzzing a tower, a sudden cyber outage somewhere, a supply chain that just mysteriously stops working.
Right.
And our first instinct is to see it as chaos or, just random aggression, maybe a technical glitch. But the sources we've got in front of us for this deep dive, they argue, and I think very convincingly, that it's not chaos at all.
No, in the slightest.
It's a conversation. It's just a very specific, very high stakes, and frankly, a very dangerous conversation. Every one of those actions is like a sentence.
And that is exactly the mission for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're looking at a pretty heavy stack of research here.
Right.
We have everything from military doctrine on the called escalation management to economic reports on the defense industrial base, and then some really fascinating intelligence analysis on this thing called gray zone warfare.
Yep.
And the whole goal is to decode that language. Because if you're just, scanning the headlines, you're not getting the real story. You're seeing the fever, but you don't know what the disease is.
Precisely. I mean, you're probably used to thinking about conflict in the way Hollywood shows it, right? Explosions, front lines.
Soldiers charging across a field, yeah.
Exactly. And look, that's definitely a part of the spectrum. It's the far end of the dial. But what these sources are showing is that the most effective warfare today, the kind that's really changing the map, often happens without a single declaration of war.
Not a shot fired.
Not a shot fired. It's happening in the code that runs our supply chains. It's happening inside our cyber networks. And it's happening in this murky, this in-between space they call the gray zone. It's a space where the objective isn't always to destroy the enemy. Sometimes it's to manipulate them or coerce them or just send a signal so clearly that it changes their mind without ever having to trigger that big shooting war.
So to try and make sense of all this, what we're going to do is map out what the researchers call the spectrum of escalation. We're going to try to understand the machinery behind it. And I mean both the physical machinery like actual factories and the political machinery of statecraft that keeps the whole world balancing on this very thin wire.
That's a great way to put it.
And we've kind of broken this down into 3 layers to make it digestible. First, we have to look at the engine, the industrial capacity that you need to even be a player in this game.
The foundation.
The foundation. Second, the gray zone itself. How do you win without actually fighting? And then finally, we'll look at the ladder. How do we get from just sending signals to actually, shooting?
It's a journey, really. It takes us from the very tangible, the nuts and bolts on a factory floor, all the way up to the psychological high-wire act of nuclear deterrence. And I think you're absolutely right to start with the industrial piece. It's crucial because in this digital age, we tend to forget the physical reality of it all.
We think it's all just software now.
We think it's all about pressing buttons, but at the end of the day, conflict is about moving mass and sustaining output. It's physics.
Okay, so let's start there with the nuts and bolts, the engine. Because, you can have the most brilliant strategies, the most sophisticated software, the best generals, But if you can't build the actual things you need to fight with, it's all just a conversation. It's a theory.
Type paper tiger.
Exactly. And I want to start with a story from the research that really, it made this concept very real for me. So let me just read this. I saw a documentary clip recently about the sprawling industrial parks in the Pearl River Delta, and it stayed with me. Imagine a woman named Lynn, a floor manager who spent a decade overseeing the assembly of high-end consumer electronics. Lately, her factory's rhythm has changed. It isn't a scene of chaotic mobilization, but a cold, calculated shift. The assembly lines that once spit out smartphone components are now churning out standardized telemetry modules for long-range systems. She watches the sheer volume, thousands of units per hour, 24/7, and realizes that her city is the physical battery of the state. In this world of attrition, the war isn't just won by the bravest soldiers, but by the fact that Lynn's factory can replace a month's worth of battlefield losses in a single weekend. Reading her story made me feel a sense of heavy realization. We often talk about military might as something abstract, but seeing it through the lens of industrial output makes it feel much more visceral. It's the terrifying realization that in high-intensity conflicts, a nation's stamina is measured in the humming of the factory floor and the exhaustion in a manager's eyes. It's not just about who has the better technology, it's about whose industrial heart can beat the longest without stopping.
Wow. That phrase, the physical battery of the state, that's incredibly powerful. And it cuts right to the heart of the issue, doesn't it?
It really does.
Lynn's story is the perfect entry point for this because it illustrates what military theorists are calling the war economy. And I think we need to just pause on that term for a second because we hear it a lot in, history documentaries.
Right. When I hear war economy, my mind immediately goes to like black and white footage, people rationing butter, buying war bonds, Rosie the Riveter posters.
Yeah.
But in the context of these modern sources, what are we actually talking about? Is it the same thing?
It's different now. It's much more integrated. The source material defines a modern war economy not just as, financial tricks or telling people to eat less bread. It's the total mobilization of a state's entire system to produce and allocate resources for one purpose, to sustain violence.
So it's about converting the entire civilian world into a military asset.
Precisely. And in Lynn's story, notice that detail about the cold, calculated shift from smartphones to telemetry modules. That is not an accident. That is not something you decide to do on a Tuesday.
No.
That's a sign of a deep, pre-planned industrial integration. It implies that the civilian industry was built from the ground up with that switch in mind. The tooling, the worker training, the supply chains, they're all designed to be dual purpose from day one.
Which creates this just tremendous amount of latent potential. It's all just sitting there waiting. It reminds me of that famous concept from World War II, the great arsenal of democracy. The sources bring this up over and over again as a comparison to where we are now.
They do, and it's a vital comparison, but mostly to show how starkly different things are now. If you look back at World War II, the United States was the ultimate war economy. The sources point out a few key advantages the U.S. had then that are really easy to forget today.
Like what?
Well, first, geography. The U.S. industrial heartland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, it wasn't being bombed. It was completely safe. They could run the factory lights all night long without a single thought about an air raid. That's a luxury no one has today.
A huge luxury.
Second, it had almost all the raw materials it needed right there within its own borders. Grain, oil, iron ore. They eventually figured out synthetic rubber. It didn't depend on a global supply chain that could be cut by a single submarine in the Atlantic. Modern economies are completely dependent on those supply chains.
And the government itself had a level of control that just seems unimaginable today. They could literally walk into a Ford factory and say, okay, stop making sedans. Tomorrow you start making tanks.
Exactly. The sources call it coerced or, heavily incentivized manufacturing. It created this total war economy. And the result was that by the end of the war, the U.S. was basically the only major economy still standing. Everyone else was in ruins.
And that created this kind of historical anomaly, this perception that persists even today, that the U.S. can just turn on production whenever it wants to, like flipping a light switch.
Yes. We have this powerful cultural memory of the sleeping giant waking up and just flooding the world with Liberty ships and Sherman tanks.
But this is where the research gets really alarming. Because the consensus in all of these documents is that assumption that we could just surge production when we need to is completely dangerously wrong for the modern era.
Completely wrong.
There's a specific word that General Joseph Dunford uses in the text that really stood out to me. He calls the modern defense industrial base, or the DIB.
Yeah.
He calls it brittle.
And that word brittle is chosen so carefully. It's an engineering term. Something that's brittle is hard, but it's not tough. It holds its shape perfectly right up until the moment it's hit with a shock, and then it doesn't bend. It shatters.
Like a glass rod versus a steel cable.
A perfect analogy. A glass rod is brittle. A steel cable is tough. And the data in our source is about a potential future conflict specifically. They ran a lot of simulations on a US-China conflict over Taiwan. It illustrates this shattering point with terrifying clarity.
Okay, let's look at the numbers, because when they say insufficient, that's a pretty mild word. The actual figures from the war games they're jaw-dropping.
They really are. The simulations consistently show that current U.S. production rates for precision-guided munitions, we're talking about the smart missiles that actually hit their targets, are, and this is a quote, wholly insufficient.
Wholly insufficient.
In a high-intensity conflict in the Pacific, the modeling shows the U.S. would burn through its entire inventory of key long-range munitions in a matter of weeks. In some cases, maybe even days.
Days. You're telling me that after a week of fighting, the world's most powerful military is essentially out of ammo for its most important weapons?
For its most advanced and most critical long-range weapons, yes. Things like the LRASM, the long-range anti-ship missile, these are incredibly complex systems. You can't just build more of them in a garage overnight.
And this isn't just some hypothetical computer game anymore, is it? We have a real-world stress test happening right now in Ukraine.
We do. And the sources point directly to the issue with 155mm artillery shells. These are the workhorses. They're not sexy. They're not high-tech. They're basically just big bullets for cannons.
The unglamorous but essential stuff.
Absolutely essential. Before the recent push to ramp things up, the U.S. was producing, maybe 14,000 to 20,000 of these shells a month. Now, with a massive effort, they are surging production, trying to get to 40,000, maybe 50,000.
Okay, so let's be generous and say they hit 50,000 a month. To the average person, 50,000 of these huge artillery shells.
Yeah.
That sounds like a mountain of ammunition.
It sounds like a lot until you look at the other side of the ledger, the burn rate. In periods of high-intensity fighting, Ukraine is firing about 90,000 of these shells per month.
90,000.
90,000. And remember, that is a proxy war, mostly confined to a single front. The math just doesn't work. We're producing, at surge capacity, barely half of what a partner needs to defend itself, let alone what the U.S. would need if it were fighting directly.
That's the brittleness right there, that deficit. Lynn's factory in the story, the one that can replace a month of losses in a single weekend, that's what you need for a war of attrition. The current U.S. system isn't built for that. It's built for peacetime efficiency, not wartime redundancy.
Which logically leads to the question, how did this happen? How does the great arsenal of democracy forget how to make bullets in large numbers? And the sources point to a very specific moment in time, 1993. It's an event often called the Last Supper.
It sounds incredibly ominous, and I guess in hindsight it was.
It was a dinner. The Secretary of Defense at the time met with all the heads of the major defense contractors. You have to remember the context. The Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall was down. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. There was this widespread belief that major state-on-state conflict was a thing of the past.
The end of history idea.
Exactly. And the government wanted what they called a peace dividend. They wanted to slash defense spending.
So the message to the industry was basically, the party's over. We don't need all this extra capacity anymore.
That was the message. They told the contractors flat out that budgets were being cut drastically and that if they wanted to survive, they had to consolidate. They essentially forced a massive wave of mergers and acquisitions.
So instead of having, say, a dozen different companies all competing to build a fighter jet, they all merged into these giants.
Yes. In just a few years, we went from 51 prime tactical contractors down to what we now know as the Big Five. That's Lockheed Martin, RTX.
Which used to be Raytheon, right?
Exactly, formerly Raytheon. Then Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and General Dynamics. It created an oligarchy.
Is that inherently a bad thing? I mean, from a business perspective, consolidation usually makes things more efficient, doesn't it?
It makes them efficient for peacetime. That's the critical distinction. It maximizes profit for shareholders. It minimizes what corporations see as excess capacity.
Right.
But in wartime, excess capacity is just another name for surge capability.
Right.
If you don't have empty factories and idle machines and a trained workforce ready to go, you can't ramp up production when a war suddenly starts.
It's like running a hospital at 100% capacity every single day to maximize revenue. It looks brilliant on a spreadsheet.
Right.
Until a pandemic hits, and suddenly you have 0 extra beds for the surge of patients.
That is a perfect analogy. The efficiency of peace becomes the liability of war. You have systematically stripped away all the buffers, all the redundancy in the system. The industrial base became lean, and lean means there's no fat left to burn when the winter comes.
Okay, so the sources don't just, admire the problem. They do offer some solutions. But you can't just snap your fingers and build 20 new missile factories overnight. These are incredibly complex facilities.
No. Absolutely not. Building new capacity takes years, sometimes a decade. But what you can do is change how you buy things, to create the incentives for the industry to expand on its own. The single biggest hurdle, according to the industry reports in our stack, is budget instability.
What do you mean by that?
The government traditionally buys ammunition on one-year contracts. So if you're a factory owner, why would you invest $10 million of your own money in a new assembly line if the government might just cut the order to zero next year?
The risk is all on you. You'd never do it.
You'd never do it. The risk is way too high. So the main solution being proposed is something called multi-year procurement, or MYP. It's simple, really. It means giving the industry a guaranteed contract for, say, 3 or 5 years. It's a promise from the government. We will buy X amount of this thing for the next 5 years, no matter what happens in the news.
And that gives the company the financial certainty they need to go to a bank, get a loan, and build that new line.
Precisely. It de-risks the investment. Another solution is modernization. We have these very old Army ammunition plants, places like Scranton, Holston, that are literally decades old. Some of the machinery actually dates back to the WWII era.
That's unbelievable.
It is. So the sources talk about bringing in modern robotics and automation. You don't necessarily need more factories. You need the factories you already have to be able to run 24/7 with higher yields and fewer bottlenecks.
And then there was something called flexible contracting.
Right. Things like IDIQ contracts. It stands for indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. It's basically a way of cutting through the bureaucratic red tape. Think of it like having an open tab at a bar. Instead of having to sign a new contract every single time you need another drink, the master agreement is already in place. So you can just place an order immediately when you need it.
The big takeaway for me from this whole section is that industrial capacity is actually a form of deterrence. We tend to think of deterrence as, nuclear missiles or a fleet of aircraft carriers. But this research strongly suggests that a boring factory floor humming away is just as intimidating to a potential adversary.
It absolutely is. You cannot escalate and you cannot sustain a high-intensity conflict if you can't manufacture the inputs. It's that simple. If Lynn's factory exists in Country A and Country B is struggling to make artillery shells, well, Country A has a massive strategic advantage before a single shot is even fired. Country B knows it has a hard stop. It has a time limit on how long it can fight. And that kind of weakness, that invites aggression.
Which brings us perfectly to a different kind of aggression. Not the loud, noisy factory floor or a kinetic battlefield, but the silent, invisible leverage of the gray zone. And this is the second major layer of our deep dive.
And this is where the very definition of war starts to get really, really blurry. We're moving from counting shells to counting glitches.
Let's set the scene with another story from the research, because this one really drove home for me just how strange and, frankly, how weird this modern battlefield is. I was scrolling through a forum for logistics professionals and came across a thread from someone working in a major global port. Let's call him Elias. He described the gray zone not as a battlefield, but as a series of digital and logistical anomalies. One morning, the GPS coordinates for his cargo ship start flickering. The next, a civilian fleet of trawlers anchors right in the middle of a vital shipping lane, refusing to move. Elias doesn't call the Navy. He uses the city's superior infrastructure, the ultra-efficient automated tugs and the redundant cyber grids, to bypass the blockade and keep the spice flowing. It's a silent victory. He's securing strategic interests without a single shot being fired, simply because his state's civilian capacity is too robust to be bullied. I found myself thinking about how sophisticated this peace actually is. It's a high-stakes game of chess where winning means being so efficient that the other side's pressure becomes irrelevant. It's a bit unsettling to realize that our daily stability depends on these invisible battles of infrastructure, where the front line is a port's control tower or a server farm. But it also shows a strange kind of pragmatic restraint.
Elias's story is a masterclass. It's a perfect encapsulation of what the sources mean when they talk about gray zone conflict. It's frustrating, it's ambiguous, and it is incredibly effective.
We hear that term all the time now, gray zone, but let's actually define it. Based on the research, what is it exactly?
The expert definition is pretty clear. The gray zone is the space on the spectrum between traditional peace and declared war. It's a state of rivalry where actors use multiple elements of their national power. So, economic coercion, political subversion, information warfare, cyber attacks to achieve their security objectives without crossing the threshold of direct attributable military violence.
So it's aggressive, it causes real harm, but it stops just short of giving the other side a clear legal justification to send in the tanks.
That's it, exactly. It rides that line. And the sources identify 3 key characteristics that make these tactics work. The first one is ambiguity. You have to cloud the intent or the attribution of the act. You create questions. Who did this? Was it a state actor? Was it a criminal hacker group? Was it just a technical glitch? If your opponent can't definitively prove you did it, or if it looks like an accident, they can't easily retaliate.
That explains the flickering GPS in the story. If Elias calls the Navy and says, "Hey, my GPS is acting weird," they're not going to launch a missile strike in response. It's below the threshold for that kind of action.
It's way below the threshold. The second, and maybe most important characteristic, is salami-slicing.
Salami-slicing?
It's a crucial concept. You make very small, incremental moves. Think about it. If you want to take a whole salami from someone and you just grab it, they're going to slap your hand away. It's a clear act of theft. But what if you take one paper-thin slice, nobody really reacts, it's too small to make a fuss about, then you take another and another. No single slice of that salami is big enough to justify starting a fight. But over time, slice by slice, you take the whole thing, you change the map, you create what's called a fait accompli, a done deal, before the other side even realizes what's happened.
And the third characteristic?
The third is targeting civil society. This isn't soldier versus soldier. This is about attacking the things that make a society function. The media, the electoral process, and critical infrastructure like Elias's port. The goal isn't to kill the enemy army, it's to make the enemy's society so dysfunctional and chaotic that they lose the will to resist.
The sources give some really concrete case studies of how different countries play this game. Seems like everyone has their own flavor of gray zone tactics. Let's start with Russia. The texts point to Crimea as the prototype for their modern approach.
Crimea is the textbook example. It was a masterclass in using deception in the gray zone. Russia didn't just roll tanks across the border with flags waving. They used a sequence. First, they prepared the cognitive environment.
What does that mean?
It means they flooded the zone with propaganda and disinformation, convincing the largely Russian-speaking population in Crimea that they were under imminent threat from the government in Kiev. They created the justification before they made the move. Then came the little green men.
These were the soldiers with no patches, no insignias on their uniforms, right?
That's right. They were wearing modern Russian combat gear, carrying standard-issue Russian weapons, moving with the discipline of professional soldiers. But they had no flags, no identifying marks, so Russia could stand up at the United Nations and say, with a straight face, those aren't our soldiers, those must be local self-defense groups.
Even though the entire world knew it was a lie.
It didn't matter if it was a lie. The point wasn't to be believed. The point was to create just enough ambiguity to freeze the Western decision-making process. By the time the West finished debating, are they Russian? Is this technically an invasion? What's our response? The territory was already secured. The salami had been sliced. They used that confusion to buy time. And by the time the fog of war cleared, the borders on the map had moved.
It's a way of freezing the conflict. Now contrast that with China. The sources describe a very different approach, something they call strategic integrated deterrence. It feels more like a construction project.
It's often more gradual, yes, and very much infrastructure-based. The classic example that everyone points to is what they've done in the South China Sea, specifically with places like Mischief Reef.
I find this example just fascinating because of the sheer audacity of it.
Yeah.
It happens so slowly you almost don't even notice it.
It is audacious. They started by building these small, rickety-looking structures on what were basically submerged rocks at high tide, and they claimed they were just weather stations or, shelters for fishermen. Very innocent. Who's going to go to war over a weather shelter?
Nobody.
Nobody. But then, over years, salami slicing, they started dredging sand. They built up massive artificial islands. Then came the runways. Then the aircraft hangars. And finally, they installed missile systems. Now they are fully militarized forward operating bases controlling vital shipping lanes. And alongside that physical construction, they use what the sources call their blue hulls.
The maritime militia.
Yes. From a distance, they just look like a massive fleet of civilian fishing trawlers. But they are state-funded, state-organized, and state-directed. They swarm disputed areas, they crowd out the navies of other countries, or they'll just block a shipping lane, just like in Elias's story. It creates an impossible dilemma. If a billion-dollar U.S. Navy destroyer fires on what looks like a simple fishing boat, the U.S. instantly looks like the brutal aggressor on the world stage. It's a trap.
And the goal there, as the sources put it, is to win the cognitive space, to make your adversary just believe that resistance is futile because you're already everywhere.
Yes. But we should be very clear here. The sources are quick to point out that the U.S. plays in the gray zone too, particularly in the cyber domain.
Right. The documents specifically mention Operation Absolute Resolve in relation to Venezuela.
They do. The sources cite comments from officials implying the U.S. has the capability to darken parts of Caracas at will. That implies a cyber-enabled disruption of the civilian power grid. This is part of a broader U.S. doctrine that's shifting towards something called persistent engagement.
That sounds very active.
It is. It's a conceptual shift. It treats cyberspace not just as a place for espionage, spying, but as a tool of active statecraft to apply pressure. You can shut down a power grid to send a very strong message without ever having to drop a bomb on a city. It's a way of saying, we can reach out and talk you without crossing that kinetic threshold.
This brings up a really surprising finding in the research that I want to drill down on for a minute. My natural assumption was that authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, would be much better at this gray zone stuff. I mean, they don't have a free press investigating the little green men. They don't have voters asking tough questions about why the power suddenly went out.
Right, that's the logical assumption.
But the expert analysis in these papers says that's not necessarily true.
This was a surprise to me as well when I was reading it. The research shows that the critical factor isn't the regime-type democracy or autocracy. The critical factor is state capacity.
So how competent your government is.
Exactly. To pull off a really complex, multifaceted gray zone operation where you have fishing boats that are coordinating with military satellites while hackers are attacking a power grid, while your diplomats at the UN are denying everything, that requires a highly competent, highly functional government. You need a bureaucracy that actually works.
The left hand has to know what the right hand is doing, and they have to be in perfect sync.
Perfect sync. The sources argue that weak states, regardless of regime type, might resort to things like terrorism or using simple proxies because that's cheap and easy. But strong states, high-capacity states, they're the ones who use these sophisticated gray zone tactics because they have the deep institutional capacity to coordinate all of these different agencies, diplomatic, economic, intelligence, military, simultaneously.
Which brings us right back to Elias in the port. His side won that silent battle, not because they had bigger guns or a more aggressive military.
No.
They won because their civilian infrastructure was better. It was more robust.
That's the key takeaway. Superior infrastructure allows a state to absorb gray zone attacks. If your cyber grid is redundant, if your port tugs are automated, if your systems are resilient, then a blockade or a cyber attack doesn't cripple you. You have resilience. And that resilience, in and of itself, becomes a weapon. It sends a message to the aggressor. Your cheap tricks won't work here. You'll have to try something much more costly.
So we've talked about the factory floor, the engine of it all. And we've just talked about the murky waters of the gray zone, the silent battles. But sometimes that dial of escalation turns even further. Sometimes signaling and cyber attacks and salami-slicing, they aren't enough. So now we need to talk about the ladder of escalation itself, how we move from these silent battles to actual kinetic violence.
And this is where the stakes get incredibly high. This is where people start dying.
I have one final story from the documents to set the stage for this last section of our deep dive. Imagine a briefing room in a regional buffer state where a commander named Merrick has spent years practicing symbolic signaling, flying jets close to the border just to show they are there. But I heard about a shift in his recent logs. The symbols weren't working anymore. The regional stability was fracturing in this new multipolar reality. Merrick had to authorize a limited kinetic action, a surgical, localized strike on a specific facility to stop a larger escalation. It wasn't about starting a war. It was a desperate, pragmatic move to prevent a total collapse of the regional order. He describes the silence in the room after the order was given, a heavy, somber silence. When I read about these shifts from symbols to actual force, I have to step back and process the ethics of it. From a distance, it looks like aggression. And as someone who values peace, it's hard to watch. But if we try to understand it from the perspective of collective survival, it's a grim calculation. It's the idea of a controlled burn to prevent a forest fire. While it's uncomfortable to admit that violence is being used as a tool for stability, it forces us to confront the messy, unpolished reality of how a multipolar world actually functions when the old rules no longer apply.
Merrick's story takes us right onto the ladder itself. He is consciously, deliberately moving from one rung to the next, because the lower rung, It just stopped working. The message wasn't getting through anymore.
Okay, so let's map out these rungs because the source material is very specific about this hierarchy. What is the very bottom rung of the ladder?
The bottom rung is what Merrick was doing for years. Symbolic signaling. This is all about the show of resolve. It includes things like verbal warnings from politicians, moving troops to a border where they can be seen, or holding large-scale military exercises. No shots are fired, but the threat is clearly communicated. It says, I am watching you, and I am ready to act.
But then you move up a step to what the sources call low-intensity kinetic action, which is essentially the gray zone we were just discussing.
Exactly. This is where things start to get physical, but they remain deniable or ambiguous. Incursions into another country's air defense identification zone, or ADIZ. Friction along a disputed border. Maybe you shoot down an unmanned drone. It's violence, but it's not war in the traditional legal sense. You're testing your opponent's defenses and their resolve.
Then comes the big jump that Merrick had to make. The sources call this rung limited war.
This is a critical distinction. A limited war involves real kinetic action. People are dying, things are exploding, but the objectives are limited. You are not trying to conquer the enemy's country. You're not trying to topple their government. You are conducting a surgical strike on a specific facility to send an undeniable message. Stop doing X, or the next strike will be worse. It's violence as a form of communication.
It's like slapping someone in the face to get them to back off, not punching them with the intent to kill them.
That's a good way to put it. But it's an incredibly dangerous game because a slap can turn into a full-blown fistfight very, very quickly if it's miscalculated.
And then there's the top rung, the one that everyone is terrified of reaching.
That's existential warfare. This is total mobilization of your entire society. The goals are absolute. Regime extinction, the total surrender of the enemy, or, in the darkest cases, genocide. This is the dark pole of the spectrum. This is World War II. This is a nuclear exchange.
Here's a question that kept coming up for me as I was reading the section. If everyone is so utterly terrified of that top rung of nuclear war, of total annihilation, then why is there so much fighting on all the lower rungs? Why doesn't the fear of the big war stop all the small wars?
That is the stability-instability paradox. And it is one of the most important and, frankly, one of the most counterintuitive concepts in modern international relations. It explains almost everything we see happening in the news today.
Unpack that for us, because the phrase stability-instability sounds like a complete contradiction.
Think of it like a house with a very, very strong roof. The roof of the global security architecture is capped by nuclear weapons, and the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, a major all-out war between great powers like the US and China, or the US and Russia, is completely irrational. It's mutual suicide. So the roof is stable. Everyone knows with a high degree of certainty that the US and Russia aren't going to start a nuclear war over a minor border skirmish.
Okay, so the top of the ladder is locked down. No one wants to go there.
But, and this is the paradox, because everyone knows the roof is capped, because everyone is so confident that it won't escalate to a nuclear exchange, it actually makes it feel safer to start fights on the ground floor. You feel like you can push your luck, have a proxy war, conduct a limited strike, because you believe the house won't collapse on top of you.
That is some truly twisted logic. So you're saying that because we know it won't go nuclear, we feel more free to shoot at each other a little bit.
That's exactly what the theory predicts, and it's what we see in practice. The stability at the strategic level, the nuclear level, creates instability at the tactical and conventional levels. You can fight proxy wars, you can conduct cyber attacks, you can have limited kinetic actions just like Merrick did, precisely because you are confident it won't spiral all the way to the top.
Speaking of proxy wars, the sources spent a lot of time on the proxy factor as a very common tool on this ladder. Why do states use proxies so much? Is it just about saving money and avoiding casualties?
Cost is certainly part of it. It's always better to expend someone else's blood and treasure than your own. But the main driver, the real prize, is plausible deniability. If a militia group that you secretly support attacks your enemy, you can stand up and say, "That wasn't me." It keeps you, as a state sponsor, off the higher rungs of the escalation ladder. It allows you to punch someone without technically being in the fight yourself.
But the research seems to suggest this is actually far more dangerous than we think. We have this idea that using proxies helps keep conflicts contained, but the data says the opposite.
It does. The data shows that conflicts involving proxies actually tend to be more lethal and have a higher risk of unintended rapid escalation.
Why is that?
It's because of the uncertainty it creates. If you are the defender, the one being targeted, and you get hit, but you don't know for sure who hit you or who ordered it, you might panic. You might feel the need to hit back much harder than the original attack warranted, just to send a clear and unambiguous signal to whoever might be listening. On top of that, proxies are notoriously difficult to control. They have their own agendas. You might tell them, just fire a few warning shots, and they might decide to blow up an entire army barracks instead.
So you lose control of the escalation dial.
You completely lose control. The very ambiguity that makes proxies so attractive is also what makes them so volatile and dangerous.
This whole discussion paints a pretty bleak picture of a world where traditional diplomacy, people in suits sitting around a polished table, seems to be fading in importance. The sources mention this profound shift from a mindset of peace versus war to a new one of stabilization.
Yes, and this is a really profound shift in how the world is being managed. One of the diplomatic perspective sources argues that we are moving into an era of kinetic diplomacy.
Kinetic diplomacy? That sounds like a total oxymoron. Diplomacy is words, kinetic is bullets.
Does that sound contradictory, doesn't it? But what it means is using military and paramilitary tools to achieve diplomatic ends. So instead of sending a negotiator to talk, you send a team of special forces to train a local group. Instead of signing a treaty, you conduct a presence operation where you just park a destroyer off someone's coast for a month.
That's communicating through the application of force.
It is. And it has the effect of marginalizing the traditional diplomat, the person from the State Department, and replacing them with the military coordinator or the intelligence operator.
And the text says this process creates what's called a state of exception.
Right. It creates a zone, both geographically and legally, where normal international law is effectively suspended in the name of national survival or regional stability. It's a purely pragmatic calculation. It's Merrick, in that briefing room, authorizing a strike to prevent a total collapse. It's not legal in the strict textbook sense, but it's seen as necessary for stabilization. It's the grim logic of we have to break the rules in order to save the game.
Okay, let's try to synthesize all of this. We have covered a lot of ground today.
We really have. We started at the very foundation, industrial capacity, the modern war economy. And we learned that you simply cannot play this game if you can't make the pieces. That brittleness of the manufacturing base, that inability to surge production of 155 millimeter shells or precision missiles is a massive vulnerability that actually invites escalation from adversaries.
Then we move from the factory floor into the gray zone. These silent, ambiguous battles of infrastructure and information. We saw how ambiguity and salami-slicing are used to achieve objectives without triggering a war, and how state capacity, just sheer bureaucratic competence, is the key to surviving and winning those silent fights. It's all about whether your ports and your power grids can take a punch and keep running.
And finally, we climbed the ladder of escalation itself. We saw how states use this whole spectrum of tools, from symbolic troop movements all the way up to limited strikes, to signal their intent and manage crises. And we learned about that deeply unsettling stability-instability paradox. The idea that the fear of total nuclear war actually encourages these smaller, messier, conventional conflicts to break out all over the world.
It really does change how you look at the news. A headline about a new factory opening in Ohio, or a strange cyber outage at a port, or a routine military exercise in the Pacific, that they stop looking like isolated events. You start to see them as sentences in this very deliberate language of conflict.
That's exactly it. The world doesn't operate on a simple on-off switch of peace or war. It runs on this complex dial. And understanding the mechanics of that dial, the factories, the cyber grids, the diplomatic signals, the military posturing, that's the only way to make sense of what otherwise just looks like chaos.
I want to end with a thought that really struck me while I was reading about Elias and the port. We have this tendency, I think, to look at restraint, the decision not to fire back, as a sign of weakness. We want to see decisive action. But when you look at that story of Elias and you understand the mechanics of the gray zone, you start to wonder, maybe true power in the 21st century isn't just about the ability to inflict violence. Maybe it's about the capacity to endure it, to navigate all that ambiguity without losing your footing, and to just keep the lights on when someone is trying very, very hard to turn them off. It suggests that in a world of complex escalation, the most powerful weapon might not be a missile, but a system that is simply too resilient to break.
I couldn't agree more. Resilience is the ultimate form of deterrence in this new era.
That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for listening.